So this one we're going to take a file for people. So in this case, it's got a file that's got last name, hours worked, and an hourly wage. So over here we've got Lambert, 34 hours worked, and they have an hourly wage of $10.50. This is not far off from the way a lot of companies end up moving data from a time clock system into a payroll system. So what we're doing is taking this text file and we're outputting the employee's name, the hours worked, and then we're going to modify that data and tell us then how much they got paid. So what we're looking for is to create something that looks like this. So enter the file name, it opens it, and instead of saying this is what they make an hour, it actually calculates that total pay. All right, so let's think about what we're going to do. We know we're going to get into this file, and I'm going to add to it. And I worked 25 hours, and I make $195 an hour and 99 cents. Just to add another data point in there. It'll look nice. I don't make that much. It'd be really, really kind of nice if I did, but in no way do I make anywhere close to that, unfortunately. So, all right. So we know we're going to get this file. So open file. So we're going to ask them to give us a file name. So very similar to what we've done already. Now we just have to my email is over here blowing up on the other side of me here. All right, so we have to open this file. So we could call it input file. Enter the file name. All right. So we're going to get a file. We're going to take in this information. Perfect. Probably helpful if I put a quote mark in there that it somehow disappeared. All right. All right. So the next thing we're going to have to do then is we have to put that into something or open that file. So we got the file name. So input file. Let's actually do this. Input file name. Just so I can separate these really quickly. So input file, so the actual data, then we're going to say is open, and then we can put in input file name, comma, R. Okay. So now we've opened that file. We entered the name. They gave it to us. We put it in. We opened it. All right. So now we need to figure out how we can pull this data out of our folder. And so that's going to be the first piece we need to do, is we're going to have to pull this data. Now, that data, if I go back and look at it, that data doesn't have a header here. Oh, that's really dumb. Hang on here. Let me make sure that that's in the right one. All right, so that data doesn't have a header, so we can read it just line by line by line and pull that data in. Then we have to figure out a way to break that data up. And so that's going to be kind of our a little harder piece for us, is to figure out how to break that up. So we know that we're going to probably have to have a loop of some kind. So read data from file. So again, I kind of like that for loop for these kinds of things. So for line in our input file. So as we go through here, then each time we're going to be able to pull in a new line. So we need to figure out how to pull this data apart. And so we have one called that split that we used before. So we can split each line of that into a separate item. So we could say data, if we just use something generic, equals line dot split. So that should break our data up into chunks. And we know that we have, in this case, we have 1, 2, 3 chunks. So if I'm going to address those individual items, I can do that with those subscripts. And remember, though, that Python starts counting at 0, so our first subscript is actually 0. So if I know that that first one is LName for last name, I can set that equal then to our data, and then use the square bracket, and I put a 0 in. So what that's going to do is take whatever's in this line at position 0, so in this case it would be Lambert, and puts that last name out there and pulls it in. So next I could pull hours, isn't it hours? Yeah, hours equals, same thing, data, but now I'm looking at that position 1. Really the second position, but again we start counting from 0. The third one is the pay rate, so I might just call it rate. And so that's data 2. Now, if we pulled all 3 of those pieces out, now I should be able to figure out, by multiplying hours times rate, what my total pay is. So total pay is going to simply be equal to hours times rate. And then I could create a print statement at the end of each one. So print, let's see, so I want LName, what did they print? Last name, hours, and they printed total pay. So, haven't gotten to formatting or anything else on there, but last name, hours, total pay. Well, let's see what happens. So I'm going to run my code. My file name is data.txt. Oh, wait a minute. Hold on. Can't multiply sequence by non... Oh, wait a minute. So remember how when we take this pieces in, they're always as strings. And I can't multiply a string times a string, because it doesn't know how to deal with that. So I need to convert these into some kind of numeric data. So our hours, at least in this case, all look like they're integers, but I'm not sure about that. So at some point somebody could put in, 34.5 hours. So I'm going to use them as a float. And I'm also going to do the same thing for this. So we know it pulled data. Let's see if it pulled it correctly. So now I'm going to run this again. All right. So now we have some other issues we need to deal with here. So we can work on that. It did seem to work, so Lambert, and it pulled 34, Osborne 22, this guy, holy cow, I make a pretty good wage for 25 hours of work, right? Alright, so we need to make it pretty. We need to do a couple of other ways to to do this, to put it into columns or however we want to do it. We also need probably this header. And we need to figure out why in line 9 it breaks and says, hey, the list index is out of range. So, a couple things we need to do to make this work a little better. So, we're reading our data. The other piece, we probably should close our close file. So there's some ways we can fix our errors in here, and some ways to make this a little better. So notice over here in their output, I guess I didn't notice that, is they're actually saying hours is an integer. They're not displaying it that way. So I may change hours to integer, and let's see what that does for me. So I changed it to integers, and I know that when I multiply an integer times a float, it's going to output me a float automatically. So there is some advantage there. So let's see what happens if I run this again. Data.txt. Alright, so now we're getting a little closer to what they're looking for in this output. So we still need to solve our why does this give me an output error? What is the reason for that? So we need to look at that, our code here a little bit, and maybe we can come up with a reason. So it goes through all of these. So trace back most recent call, and it says line 9 is looking for data at space 0. Well, I don't really have any data there, and in fact, if I modify it back to my original, let's see what happens. Did I inadvertently put a, if I click on that, no, still says, hey, we've got something that's out of range. And so in other words, it's running this one too many times. Does that make sense? Because we run it through and it gets all 3 names, and then it comes back and tries to pull a 4th line out of that file. And when it does that, there's nothing there for it to pull out. So we may have to do a little manipulation to figure out how to do that. All right. So this gets us our data. It gets us started on there, on where we need to be. The couple of other things that it's going to want. So we need to solve why does it ask one more time. And we need to format so that it looks similar to this. So enter the file name and it gives you a name, hours, and total pay. So if I run the check on it right now, let's see what it's going to give me. Let's see if it gives me a hint in some of these. 3 of 4 tests. So it deleted files, it created file, correct output. Input. So it's, let's see, expected output. So why, I'm not really sure right offhand why it doesn't like that one. I think it's because we haven't formatted it correctly yet. So it's looking for some way to get those formats across because it can't quite recognize them. Alright, so a whole bunch of different ways we could look at this. So it doesn't hiccup because of this last module. So in fact, it's very, very picky about the fact where your cursor's at. So we don't have any error checking at this point on this file. So typically we would actually do an error check. So we would jump out of this immediately if we didn't have any data. So if line equals false, essentially, then we would jump right out of that. So you could do that. So if line equals and you could do a breakout right there. And so that's one way you can solve that kind of thing. So again, we're not sanitizing this input at all. We're just taking raw data. We don't know what's in there, and we don't know why or anything else on that. So there are a lot of ways that we could format this. And so I'm going to leave some of that formatting to you. There, you could do it as simple as and you could use the tab command. To go the right direction, it's helpful. To tab those across. So in this case, now if I run this, let's see if I can make it run. So in this case, oh, it actually printed this. That's odd. Shouldn't have done that. Must have been something weird with my... Oh. Alright. So you could move them using the tab commands. There's a lot of other ways that we can organize those. So you need to figure out how to sort those out. So looking through your book, there's a lot of sections about how to do those kinds of things. In here, it's already hiccuping, so we may have to come up with a slightly different model. Now, if I use another data set, weirdly it doesn't happen. So it could very well be that there's a character in this data set. And notice those extra lines that are in there. So now, I suspect if I run this, hang on, it's really helpful if I run the code page. Now it's going to put those out there, and notice it spreads them out. I probably went too far, but that's certainly one way you could do that. So there's a lot of different ways you can do it. When I looked at this text file, so notice, for whatever reason, it wants to put another line down there. And so I could see that it had a line, and it's in that text file as a blank line. So you could put your own name in there. 10 point, we said it had to be an integer. 10 hours and $246 an hour. So now if I rerun that, there's a lot of different ways you can manipulate that around. So look for a way to put that correctly in the right columns. The other one I don't have that it's going to yell at me. So if you look at your directions, I didn't put so here's our sample output. I didn't put a header on each one. And so you would do that up here for print statement. If you put it inside of this loop, you're going to run that repeatedly over and over and over again. But again, this is kind of a real world. We have a data file, and here we have to pull out these pieces of information. So I can break it apart, and more interestingly then, I can assign them a value. But I have to make sure my data is correct. So I have to sanitize that data. So right now, it's going to hiccup. Now it won't. So it's as easy as looking at that text file that way. All right. Let me look at one more item here real quickly. So your discussion board, there is an assignment inside of your discussion board. So a couple of things that are really hideous with this. One One, you have to create a countdown timer. So last week, a week and a half ago, you had to create a clock up. Now you're going to have to create a clock down. You have to display the minutes and seconds to me. One of the things that we've already learned, and a lot of you have figured out, that clear screen command can work, but only if you're running the program outside of that integrated development environment. So, here's what I would encourage you to think about. I would use a nested loop. I would use a nested loop where I have minutes and I have seconds. You could even ask the user to put in how many minutes this countdown is going to go. Remember that you can decrease instead of increase. So instead of saying, I'm just going to open this up and use this as some sample space here. So instead of saying for X in range 1 through 5, you can actually do it where it counts down. So remember that you can do through 5, 1, and you could even change that. So now you could put a loop, so you could do minutes in range 3 to 1. So you could do those kinds of things to do that. You can count backwards on those. So on your output, if you do the clear screen and you run it externally, that's a really handy thing to do. If you want that to not go away, remember at the very end of your file, you need an input that looks like, press any key to exit. And again, that's because if I look at my files, let's find one here. So, documents, Python files. So, if I drag this over and I run whatever this was, so there's a clock, or the format of a clock. So, if I don't have that input statement at the end, as soon as this program finishes running, it's going to just disappear off the screen. So if I did, notice how it just disappeared because I don't have that input at the end. If I look at it though, and I edit it, so I put an input at the end, press any key, now, your password, oh, I forgot to save it. Well, it would actually hold it open then, waiting for you to push any key. So if you're going to run it externally from there, that's not a bad place to go. So again, if I want to hold it open so it shows on the screen like that, I just put this blank input at the end of it. So this shouldn't be a horrible assignment. Where it's really mean is you can't see what other people have done until you turn in yours. But I think once you see what other people are doing, you're going to be kind of surprised. So the way not to do it, is do a single loop. For X in range, like 3 minutes, 3 times 60 is 180 seconds, so range 300 to 0. No. Does it technically work to count down from 3 minutes? Yes. But what I'd like to do is look at minutes and seconds together. So it really does look like some kind of a countdown clock. So if you run into issues with that as you're working on those, send me an email. I can possibly give you a pointer in going there. There are lots of resources outside of our textbook, but everything you need you can find in our textbook. You can find at python.org. So there's tons of things here. that you can find. There's other tutorials. The only thing I will say is I welcome you to go out and look at what other people do. Do your own work. If you copy it out of one of these code sharing sites, I'll probably recognize it and go, nope, that's not your own work. So just that little word of warning to try not to do that. All right, so that is your assignments for then the rest of this week. Next week we go on to new and more exciting things, and we've only got 5 weeks left after this, isn't it? Or 6 after this. So anyway, I appreciate all your hard work. Make sure you've got those turned in by Sunday at midnight.